Marla Venn was last seen leaving a late-night lecture at Westbridge University, her keys in one hand, phone in the other. She never made it to her car. 72 hours later, her apartment was found untouched, her belongings exactly where she left them. No signs of struggle, no messages, no body. For 5 years, her case remained a haunting mystery. Until a woman named Cora Lyle, arrested in a different state, under a different name, whispered 5 chilling words to a nurse. They said I survived Phase 4. Marla Venn had always lived a quiet but intentional life. Elk Ridge, Washington was a sleepy town tucked between dense forests and mist-covered hills, the kind of place where everyone knew your name but kept to themselves just enough to avoid meddling. At 29, Marla was known in town as a freelance journalist who dug into stories that others wouldn't touch. She was bold, meticulous, and fiercely private. Her neighbors described her as polite but distant. The clerk at the local library said she often borrowed books on psychology, forensic science, and conspiracy theories. She didn't have many close friends, but she was always seen with her worn leather satchel, a camera slung over her shoulder, and that ever-watchful look in her eyes. On the evening of March 4, 2017, something shifted. At precisely 6:32 p.m., Marla was captured on a convenience store camera buying a small bottle of water and a pack of gum. Her phone records show she made one last call, an unanswered attempt to reach a number later traced to an unlisted burner phone. She never returned to her apartment. When her landlord noticed 3 days of uncollected mail and her rent envelope still taped to the door, he contacted the police. Her disappearance didn't make the news right away. In towns like Elk Ridge, adults were allowed to vanish if they chose. But her sister, Callie, knew something was wrong. Marla wasn't the kind to just leave without a trace. She had unfinished work, a half-written article on her desktop, and a calendar filled with notes, interviews, and red-circled dates. The police began their search, starting with her small third-floor apartment. Everything was in its place, no signs of forced entry. Her laptop was open, the screen still on, frozen on a page from an academic journal about memory suppression. Her phone was found in her car, which was parked 2 blocks from her building. The car was locked, the keys were missing. What disturbed investigators most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No fingerprints on the steering wheel. No DNA but Marla's in the car. No tire tracks, no witnesses. Even the traffic cameras on the nearby street had been offline that day due to a citywide system upgrade. It was as if Marla had simply dissolved into the air between her apartment and her car, leaving behind only questions and echoes. 2 weeks in, the search widened. Dogs were brought in, drones scanned the surrounding woods, helicopters circled over Elsom Reservoir. Nothing. Not even a scrap of clothing. The media caught on eventually, turning her into a cautionary tale of small-town mystery. Online theories spiraled. Some claimed she'd run off to escape a stalker. Others believed she'd faked her disappearance for a new identity. But those who knew Marla understood the truth was far more complex. She had been researching something dangerous. Her browser history was wiped clean, but her notes, handwritten and scattered in the margins of old books, suggested she had been following a lead involving a long-abandoned facility near the edge of town. She had written only one word in bold red ink across a torn-out map: Reverie. The authorities couldn't figure out what it meant. No businesses or landmarks bore the name. When Callie asked to view Marla's last written story drafts, most were encrypted, and one had been corrupted beyond recovery. The only piece left was a single sticky note found under Marla's desk, barely legible. Truth is in the shadows, but the shadows erase the truth. The investigation stalled, theories cooled, and Elk Ridge returned to its rhythm, pretending nothing had happened. But for those who had followed Marla's work, the silence felt staged, forced, too clean. And somewhere in the dark folds of the forest, or beneath the surface of that still black reservoir, a secret remained, one waiting to be uncovered. But whatever had taken Marla didn't leave mistakes behind. Not yet. It was nearly 2 months after Marla Venn's disappearance when something unexpected surfaced. Not a person, not a body, but an object. On a rainy April morning, a maintenance worker named Peter Hollins was called to the basement of Marla's apartment building to inspect a leaking pipe. The building, old and creaking with age, had long hidden its secrets in dark corners and dust-covered crawl spaces. While maneuvering around a rusted furnace unit behind a stack of disused furniture, Peter noticed a faint glint, something wedged between the base of the furnace and the wall. At first he assumed it was a charred piece of cardboard, but as he tugged it free, the edges cracked like burned paper. It was a notebook, half-burned, damp, and smeared with soot. The notebook was thick with tension. The cover had no label. The pages inside were filled with disjointed writing. Names, codes, dates, and cryptic annotations. There were symbols in the margins, circles around certain dates, and erratic lines connecting one word to another. Several pages had been torn out. Others were scorched beyond recognition. But one thing was clear. This had belonged to Marla authorities. Were notified immediately, forensic analysts began to study the notebook, preserving what little they could. The first intact page that stood out contained only one sentence, written in bold, slanted handwriting. "If I disappear, start with the water." The message sent a ripple through the investigation team. The only notable body of water near Elk Ridge was Elsom Reservoir, a sprawling man-made lake bordered by cliffs and pine woods. Once used for hydroelectric power, the facility was decommissioned years earlier, and the dam now sat quietly, visited only by the occasional hiker or reckless swimmer. But Marla had mentioned it in passing before her disappearance. Her calendar had the word Elsom circled 3 times. It hadn't made sense. Until now. A search was quickly organized. Local police teamed with a dive unit from Olympia, sending a team into the cold, murky depths of the reservoir. They found debris, old tools, rusted barrels, but no Marla, nothing definitively tied to her. Yet the air around the search felt charged, as if the water itself was keeping secrets. The notebook, meanwhile, continued to yield hints. One partial page included the words "Reverie Cycle," underlined repeatedly. Below it were the names of 5 towns spread across the Pacific Northwest, each accompanied by strange notations. Subject 4, redacted, asset transfer confirmed, and a question mark followed by the letters NER. Investigators couldn't decipher much, but one of the names caught their attention. North Elsom wasn't on any map. It wasn't a recognized neighborhood or development. But when police scoured old land registry files, they found something curious. A fenced property registered in 1998 to a now-defunct biotech company called Virex. The parcel was labeled Research Site C. Records showed it had been officially shut down in 2002, after Virex was sued over unauthorized chemical dumping. After that, the site had supposedly been abandoned. Yet satellite images told a different story. Aerial photos from just 6 months earlier showed tire tracks, fresh gravel laid near the gate, and faint signs of structural repair to the main building. Someone had been there. Recently. Then came the most disturbing clue of all. Marla's cloud account, previously inaccessible due to encryption, was finally cracked by digital forensic experts. Among hundreds of corrupted files, they recovered a single photo. It showed Marla standing near a rusted gate draped in barbed wire. Behind her was a heavily forested area. A sign, half covered in vines and peeling paint, could just barely be read. North Elsom Research Compound, property of Virex Biotech. Her face in the photo looked determined, but something in her eyes betrayed tension. Fear, maybe. She wasn't just exploring. She was onto something. Investigators began to wonder, had Marla found her way into this forgotten facility? Had she uncovered something dangerous? Something worth silencing her over? The questions were growing darker, and the answers were buried in places no one had wanted to dig. Until now, reaching the North Elson research compound was not easy. The road that once led to the facility had been swallowed by the forest, overgrown with tangled roots and thick brush. The only signs that a path had ever existed were faint tire ruts nearly erased by time and weather. A special team was dispatched: law enforcement, a forensic crew, and 2 environmental safety officers. Their job was simple in theory: investigate the abandoned facility, document anything related to Marla Venn, and determine whether the building had been illegally reactivated. But the moment they arrived at the rusted gate, it became clear that something was wrong. The barbed wire fencing had been recently patched, and the gate's lock was new, shiny, untouched by years of weather. This wasn't a ruin. It was a sealed vault. Once inside, the team entered a crumbling main building covered in layers of moss and dust. The air was still and sour, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for years. Floor tiles were cracked underfoot, ceilings sagged. But deeper inside, where daylight couldn't reach, the environment changed. Dust gave way to cleanliness. Footprints led down sterile hallways, past storage rooms filled with modern medical crates and unmarked metal canisters. One of the environmental officers discovered a breaker panel that had been rerouted with new wiring. With a flip of a switch, a low hum filled the space. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating something that no one had expected: a lab. Fully intact, fully powered, and chillingly organized. Stainless steel tables lined the walls. Cabinets contained syringes, vials, and stacks of lab notes. On one table sat a monitor connected to a hard drive. Its screen flashed an error message: access denied. Subject files restricted. That was when they found the blood. A hallway near the back of the lab led to a locked door. Forced open, it revealed a small, windowless chamber, part of the original underground testing section. Along one wall was a series of metal cages. Most were empty, rusted, but one held a dark stain on the floor, dry and flaking. Embedded in the corner was something small and metallic. Forensics carefully extracted it. A necklace, tangled and dulled, but still recognizable. It had belonged to Marla Venn. To the team had still not found her body, the presence of the necklace, along with a smear of her DNA, confirmed that Marla had been there. And more disturbingly, she had been held there, alive, after her disappearance. Attention quickly shifted to the stack of documents found locked inside a filing cabinet. The files were labeled Project Reverie 9. Inside were diagrams, dosage charts, psychological assessments, and what appeared to be memories. One note read, "Cognitive reset window, 11-14 days post-dosage. Must monitor for regression and hallucinations." Another stated, D43 injection causes memory deconstruction at cellular level. Subjects show 65% compliance after 3rd cycle. It became horrifyingly clear. This facility hadn't just been abandoned. It had been operating underground, quietly, beyond the reach of oversight. And whatever Reverie was, it involved human experimentation on a scale the team had never seen. At the far end of the hallway, a hidden elevator shaft was discovered behind a wall panel. The shaft's cables had been cut, making it unusable. But when a forensic climber descended on rope, he reached a lower level untouched by decay. More labs, more cages, and an observation room facing a long, narrow chamber with a single chair bolted to the floor, straps still hanging from the armrests. There was no doubt anymore. Marla hadn't vanished randomly. She hadn't gotten lost or fled. She had been captured. And this place, quiet, forgotten, surrounded by forest, had been the last place she'd been seen. But what exactly had been done to her here remained buried in whispers, coded files, and bloodstains, and the worst was still to come. The files found deep within the North Elsom facility told a story more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. There were dozens of manila folders, each labeled with a subject number and a short identifier, gender, age, and a curious phrase, phase designation. Some subjects were marked as failed, others were retained, but 17 were marked with a chilling designation, reconstructed. Among the folders, one stood out. The tab read Subject 9 Venn M. Inside were nearly 24 pages. The first was a standard intake form, dated March 5, 2017, just one day after Marla had disappeared. The form contained her full name, blood type, and psychological risk profile. Underneath, someone had written in red ink, Ideal candidate, high resistance equals high yield. The rest of the file chronicled a step-by-step transformation. It described a process called neurocognitive identity reconstruction, or NARC, that used targeted chemical injections, immersive sensory conditioning, and prolonged isolation to wipe and rebuild memory pathways. Victims were referred to as shells, and once cleared of previous identity markers were reassigned names, backstories, and even language skills. Marla's reconstructed identity was listed as Cora Lyle, a woman with no criminal record, no social media presence, and no known family ties. She had supposedly relocated to Montana for a fresh start. The last note in her file simply read, Phase 3 complete. Deployment successful. The implications were staggering. Marla hadn't just been taken. She had been erased and rebuilt. Everything that made her who she was, her memories, her relationships, her work, had been intentionally stripped away and replaced with a fabricated life. But the next discovery shifted the case from horrifying to grotesque. Cora Lyle, the new identity assigned to Marla, had been arrested just 3 weeks earlier in Bozeman, Montana, after a violent outburst in a grocery store. She'd shoved a shopper to the floor after claiming she was being watched through the lights. Officers described her as paranoid and confused. Her fingerprints didn't return any records. Her ID was clean but strangely new, issued only 6 months prior. Authorities in Washington requested a DNA sample from Cora, now being held for psychiatric evaluation. The results were definitive. Cora Lyle was Marla Venn. The woman in the Montana hospital bore only a faint resemblance to the Marla seen in old photos. Her hair had been dyed, her posture different, her speech more formal and deliberate. She didn't respond to the name Marla. She didn't recognize her sister, Callie, when shown a photo. She believed she had been born in a foster home in Arizona and had worked as a library technician in Reno. None of it was real. Peace psychological assessments found deep inconsistencies in her personality, signs of repressed trauma, and sudden flashes of unknown languages, Russian, German, even fragments of Latin. In one moment of lucidity, she had asked a nurse, "What phase am I in now?" But when questioned further, she became agitated and confused. It was clear she had been through something irreversible. Investigators began cross-referencing the other subject files. 5 had been located across the country under new names and identities, none of them aware of their past. Most had been diagnosed with unexplained psychiatric symptoms. 2 were in long-term care facilities. 1 had vanished again without a trace. There were still 12 unaccounted for. The larger picture was emerging, and it was terrifying. The facility at North Elsom had not been shut down. It had evolved. Under the guise of a bankrupt biotech company, a network of operators had been capturing individuals, many of them investigative threats or vulnerable targets, and stripping them of who they were. The aim wasn't just to hide them, it was to overwrite them. Reformat the human brain like a hard drive, scrub it clean, and install something new, something useful. And the worst part? It had worked. Marla was living proof. Only now, she didn't know who Marla Venn was. But someone out there did. As news quietly spread through back channels of law enforcement that Marla Venn had been found alive but deeply altered, another layer of the mystery began to emerge, one more insidious than anyone had feared. The files from the North Elsom facility were only the beginning. Hidden within a corrupted server recovered from the lower lab, analysts discovered a second cache of data. Fragments of emails, audio logs, and encrypted protocols linked to a secretive program under the codename Project Hollow Root. Unlike Project Reverie, which focused on memory dismantling and identity reconstruction, Hollow Root appeared to be a containment protocol. Its purpose wasn't just to erase individuals, it was to redirect them, to insert them back into society under controlled identities, where they could be monitored, manipulated, or triggered for unknown objectives. These subjects, as the documents referred to them, were seeded into various levels of public life. Teachers, healthcare workers, municipal staff, and, chillingly, journalists. Cross-referencing dates and deployment codes revealed that several of the Hollow Root subjects had been placed years before Marla ever disappeared. Her abduction, it seemed, hadn't been an isolated case. It was part of a continuing operation, and now that she had resurfaced, something had been set in motion. Only a few days after the discovery in Montana, strange things began happening. Two of the forensic analysts who had handled Marla's file were found dead within 24 hours of each other, one in a suspected car accident on a rural highway, the other from an apparent overdose in his apartment. Neither had any history of drug use or risky behavior, no suicide notes, no warning signs. The lead investigator on the case, Detective Mira Sutherland, began receiving encrypted messages on her personal email files she had never requested, containing surveillance footage, lab blueprints, and names of people not yet mentioned in any reports. One video clip showed a figure, blurry and cloaked in darkness, walking into the North Elsom compound just 3 days before the search team had arrived. The figure used a biometric scanner to enter. The system should have been offline for years, but the scanner worked. Whoever this was, they had access, and they hadn't come to clean up. They had come to monitor. As pressure mounted, Mira made a decision. She had to speak to Marla. Alone. With special clearance, she visited the Montana facility. When she entered the secure ward, she saw her for the first time. Marla sat in a chair by the window, her gaze vacant, her fingers tracing the edges of a paperback novel she didn't seem to be reading. Her appearance had changed, but something in her presence, something underneath, felt watchful. Quietly, Mira introduced herself and sat down, saying only one thing. "Do you remember Reverie?" For a long moment there was no response, but then Marla blinked slowly. Her fingers stopped moving. She looked directly at Mira and whispered, almost inaudibly, "They said I was the first to survive Phase 4. And then she screamed. The episode lasted nearly 10 minutes. Hospital staff rushed in. Mira was removed. Later, they told her Marla had suffered a neurological destabilization event, triggered by stress or perhaps something embedded deeper in her memory matrix, something waiting to be reawakened. Whatever it was, it had been sleeping inside her all this time, dormant but alive. Back in Washington, Mira received one final message. It contained a single image, a satellite photo of a compound, larger than North Elsom, located in a desolate stretch of land near the Canadian border. The file name was simple, Reverie Prime. North Elsom had only been one of many. Marla wasn't the last subject, she was only the first. The coordinates sent to Mira Sutherland led to a patch of wilderness near the Canadian border, an area so remote it barely showed up on government topographic maps. A former mining site, abandoned since the 1970s, the land was now marked as protected conservation territory. No construction permits, no registered activity. And yet, the satellite image told a different story. Through the tree canopy, shadows betrayed the outlines of multiple structures, rectangular, symmetrical, too precise to be natural. Something was hidden out there, something big. An off-the-record task force was assembled. Operatives from 3 agencies, all handpicked for discretion. No official documents, no public trails. Aerial surveillance was forbidden. They were told only what they needed to know. This compound, referred to in the file as Reverie Prime, was likely connected to the unauthorized experiments discovered at North Elsom. The operation was to be surgical, quiet, fast. They reached the perimeter just after midnight. Through thermal optics, they detected movement. 6 individuals patrolling the exterior, all dressed in identical black uniforms without insignia. No lights, no noise. The silence was more unsettling than any resistance. As the team breached the outer fence, they encountered their first real confirmation. Hidden motion sensors, recently installed, and a backup generator quietly humming underground. This was no relic from decades past. Reverie Prime was operational, and someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. Inside, the compound stretched across several levels, descending deep underground. Surveillance rooms, medical labs, server stacks humming in glass chambers, and rooms, rows of them, small, sterile, windowless, each one identical, each one locked. When the locks were disabled, what they found inside turned even the most seasoned agents cold. Each room held a person, sedated, monitored, tubes in their arms, eyes closed but twitching as if trapped inside a dream. Men and women of all ages, some appeared barely out of their teens, others were gray-hailed. On a wall monitor beside each bed there were charts, memory cycle status, response level, and a timer that counted down in red digits. Most had hours remaining, some only minutes. The files discovered in the control room revealed the full extent of the operation. Project Reverie had evolved far beyond memory reconstruction. What had begun as experimental mind-wiping had shifted into something even darker: programmable identity layering. Not only were these individuals being erased and rebuilt, they were being conditioned to carry out tasks upon waking, tasks chosen by an unknown handler. Assassinations, infiltration, sabotage. They weren't just erasing lives anymore, they were creating weapons. Marla had been a prototype. She had survived Phase 4 because her original identity had resisted total erasure. But instead of being terminated, she was studied, watched, released as a test. The incident in Montana wasn't a breakdown. It was a trigger event that had gone wrong. The programming failed. Marla's real self had tried to resurface, but not all the subjects had failed. In the data logs, Mira found something even more chilling. One file marked "confirmed active." The subject's new identity was listed as a political analyst in D.C., recently hired by a powerful lobbying group. The programming status? Fully integrated. As Mira prepared to shut down the compound and call in reinforcements, an alarm suddenly echoed through the corridors. Not triggered by motion, not from the breach. It came from one of the rooms. A subject was waking up, unscheduled. The screen beside the bed blinked rapidly. Words scrolled across. Phase 5 engaged. Directive: neutralize breach. Before anyone could react, the subject sat upright. Eyes open, pupils dilated. She looked directly at the closest agent and smiled. The compound erupted in chaos that night. Communications from the team went dark. Only one brief transmission made it out before the signal was lost. They're not sleeping, they're waiting. Reverie Prime vanished from every database within 48 hours, and Marla Venn, still fragmented, still haunted, was relocated under government protection. But she knows the truth. She was never meant to be found. And those still buried in dreams, they're waking up.